Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today we're talking about editors-in-chief at Marvel. I'm making this episode shortly after Marvel Comics has announced a new editor-in-chief, Stephen Wacker, who will take the place of the outgoing C.B. Cebulski. I hope for Marvel's sake that is a good thing because they have needed a shake-up for a while now. I think that's putting it mildly. The editor-in-chief, for those who aren't aware, sets the overall direction for the comics. They approve storylines, they'll set up distribution channels, work on bringing in the best talent to the company. Generally, they're given the company its identity. Now, there have been, over the years, 14 different editors-in-chief for Marvel, if I include their history in the Golden Age, when they were Timely and then Atlas, before becoming known as Marvel Comics. Some of these guys are really well known, like Stan Lee, Jim Shooter, Joe Quesada. Some of them not as well known. Anybody out there know who Vincent Fago is? So anyway, I thought that this would be the perfect time, and hopefully interesting to all of you, to discuss some of the highs and lows of each editor. And I'll be placing them on a tier list. Everyone loves tier lists, right? Hopefully. I hope people like that. Anyway, viewers are probably going to like it because, you know, my opinions always line up 100% with all of my viewers. It's just, I'm so lucky that way. Anyway, maybe they don't want to hear what I have to say about this, but let me know who you think was a good editor-in-chief and why, or the people that maybe weren't so good. So, all that being said, hit like, subscribe, leave a comment. Let's get it going. We're going to start with Joe Simon. Now, Joe Simon was asked by publisher Martin Goodwin to be the editor-in-chief at Timely Comics in 1939. He held that position for 2 years. It was a somewhat informal position back then, but it was also a very small company back then. During that time, Joe Simon co-created Captain America with Jack Kirby. That is a huge addition and obviously a huge success. That gave Timely a lot of its identity. You know, they had a hit superhero. There were plenty of publishers in the Golden Age that didn't have that hit superhero, and they didn't last. Simon and Kirby left in 1941 for more pay over at National Comics, which would become DC. So this is a brief tenure. Actually, like a lot of the future editors I'm going to mention. But Captain America alone, at the beginning, that meant a lot to Marvel, or the company that became Marvel. And I think I'm being fair by putting Joe at a B for growing the company. Next, we got to talk about Stan Lee, who started as editor-in-chief in 1941 and basically held that position all the way to 1972, although there is a break in there that I'll talk about in a little bit. But look, Stan Lee was a Nepo hire, right? He was the nephew of Martin Goodwin. And if we just look at his work as editor throughout the Timely and Atlas eras, I'd call it average at best. But he did usher in Marvel's Silver Age success. Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Hulk, X-Men, dozens more. I'd certainly credit Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko with the vast majority of that creation. But as editor-in-chief, Stan Lee did keep that talent there for a good run. And I think he got their best work out of them. Stan Lee also pioneered the Marvel method. That's where a writer would just sort of give the gist of a plot and then let the artist draw. I've got an episode all about it. But I think that certainly helped Marvel get comics out at a good pace. And it delivered inspired artwork from their bullpen of artists, mostly because those artists were primarily responsible for crafting that story. They were invested. Stan Lee served as editor from, as I say, 1941 through 1972, minus a hiatus during World War II. He was drafted into the Army. But Silver Age 1960s Marvel, when he's editor-in-chief, that is when Marvel created the most characters, and also delivered a slightly more grounded take on things that appealed to the aging readership. Now, there are some notable lows. As the 70s began, Marvel, I would argue, overextended themselves and quality began to dip. I think you could also very easily argue that Stan Lee hogged a lot of credit, and ultimately he did alienate artists like Kirby and Ditko.
I can tell you that I wrote a few lines myself above every panel that
Yes, I've seen those.
They weren't printed in the book.
All right, look, both of you, hey, kids.
For a while anyway, they did both come back. Still, this is the beginning of the Marvel Universe, and it was massively successful. It's really hard to overstate that success. I'm not ranking Lee as a person or as a writer, but I think as editor-in-chief, I think I have to put him in the S tier. It is an iconic era. This is the foundation of Marvel as we recognize it. So now let me talk about Vincent Fago, who was the acting editor-in-chief from 1942 to 1945. Does anyone here remember Vincent? He drew a lot of Marvel's successful funny animal books at the time, like Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal. He also served as acting editor-in-chief while Stan Lee was drafted, 42 through 45. He built up a bunch of those funny animal books, and that's sort of what kept that company alive during the war years. However, this is also sort of a low, a knock against him, because Fago didn't do anything to keep superheroes popular. Overall, superheroes lost momentum during this era. Overall, I don't think he really made an impact for good or bad. And I'll give him a D. Not trying to be mean, but in comparison to other editors, he's insignificant to Marvel's history. Roy Thomas. He served from 1972 to 1974. Roy Thomas was a young writer handpicked by Stan Lee to be his successor. Roy emphasized continuity and history. Successful books like The Defenders and The Invaders were books that Roy Thomas started under his tenure. Those are good examples. Now, Thomas notably helped Marvel get the Conan the Barbarian license and wrote that. That became a huge hit and a revenue generator. Roy Thomas was mostly liked by the talent, mostly. He gave opportunities to a bunch of young writers. Len Wein, Steve Englehart, guys like that helped Marvel find a new voice as Stan Lee stepped back. Some of the creators that were given big opportunities during Roy's era, they included Jim Starlin. He really fleshed out the cosmic side of Marvel. Neil Adams had a bit of a brief run. John Buscema grew in tremendous popularity during this time. So he was good at scouting talent, no question there, and giving them the right project. Roy also expanded Marvel's types of titles to include horror. They were pushing back at the comics code. They were, it wasn't going back to EC comics style, Tales from the Crypt, but they were doing stuff with Dracula and other monsters. Characters that were created under his leadership, they included Ghost Rider, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Adam Warlock, Thanos, Blade, Werewolf by Night, quite a few for just that, not even 3-year period. For lows, I'll say it was a short tenure. And I don't think that Roy loved the business side of things. I think he liked the creative side. After Roy's relatively short time in the role, it led to several unstable years for Marvel. I think balancing all that out, I'm going to give Roy a B. So let's talk about Len Wein, who served between 1974 and 1975. Great writer. Didn't stay as editor-in-chief very long. His biggest contribution was writing Giant-Size X-Men #1 while he was editor, which brought in popular new characters like Storm and Nightcrawler, rolled in his recent co-creation Wolverine, and then, to his credit, he handed that off to Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum, up-and-comers who really ran with it. For Lowe's, he didn't really break anything, but he didn't really innovate either. He only held the role for about 9 months, which meant Marvel was starting to lose direction. Deadlines started to slip as well. I'm right on the edge of B and C. I think as editor-in-chief, I think I'm going to give him a C. As a writer and a person, he's fantastic. That would be much higher. Editor-in-chief, I think C. I'm still being fair. Marv Wolfman was the next guy in 1975. And Marv Wolfman is almost the exact same story as Len Wein. They were pals, they were great writers, but Marv also stayed for less than a year and didn't innovate a lot, but he also didn't break or ruin anything. He nurtured some writers like Doug Mensch and Bill Mantlo. They went on to have very long, successful careers at Marvel. However, Marv Wolfman did have one big contribution. He created the idea of fill-in issues. These were one-shot stories that Marvel would hold on to in case a title was going to miss its deadline, and then one of those could just fit right in. That really shored up their scheduling problems, gave opportunities as well to a bunch of new voices. So I will happily give Marv a B. It's just one idea, but one fantastic idea is so much better than a bunch of bad or average ones. Next is Jerry Conway in 1976. So Jerry Conway was really young when he was given editor-in-chief role in 1976. He was only 24, and he only held the role for about a month. I love Jerry as a writer. Punisher, Power Girl, Killer Croc, back and forth at Marvel, tons of important things. The death of Gwen Stacy, I think that's pretty much the beginning of the Bronze Age. Things are getting more serious. Really good writer. But as editor-in-chief, I have no choice but to give him a D. Insignificant. He didn't bring the company down, but he really didn't do anything either. He didn't have enough time. Archie Goodwin. He served from 1976 through 1978. And Archie Goodwin was meant to be a short-term editor-in-chief until Marvel hired someone new, but he actually held the role for a little longer than the last three guys. Just over a year and a half, I want to say. Here's one cool thing he did. Archie was directly involved with securing the Star Wars license, which was a bit of a gamble, but that ended up being a huge source of revenue for Marvel. Star Wars was so popular. On the downside, I'll say deadlines began to slip again. There wasn't really any big talent that was hired in this era. There were no super notable storylines I can point to and say, that's something that Archie Goodwin approved. It was business as usual. I'm going to give it a C. Time for Jim Shooter. 1978. He served all the way through 1987. Jim Shooter was young. While he had a stern way of dealing with the talent, he actually made business changes that grew Marvel in a big way. Under his leadership, Marvel actually reached about 80% of the comic book market share for a while. That's humongous. He instituted a royalty system to pay talent more and also initiated a new policy to return original art to artists. That's pretty artist-friendly, especially for its time. That was revolutionary. Jim Shooter launched the expansion into the direct market, which was also huge for the 80s, and I think really helped Marvel at the time, not just selling to places like convenience stores and stuff where they could actually return unsold copies, but selling to comic book shops. And look, now we've gone too far in the other direction, but still, huge, huge move in the 80s. For good or ill, but mostly for good at this point, he created the first major crossover event with Secret Wars. That was also a big hit. Beyond being a hit comic book, it tied into promoting action figures, and that was pretty huge. Shooter introduced Marvel's first graphic novels, and that was before publishers made trade paperback collections or anything, so graphic novels were really big and new. Under Shooter's era, the X-Men and Daredevil, those became huge hits. He hired a bunch of talented newcomers like Walt Simonson and Frank Miller, pretty big names. Shooter cracked down. He also made sure that Marvel's books came out on time. And some people bristled at how bossy he was about that. But for the business side of things, that was a major plus. The lows all have to do, though, with his persona and his attitude and how he would deal with talent, which was admittedly heavy-handed. He would dictate the direction of stories, and that did alienate some writers who felt that they didn't have enough control. And he ended up, basically losing certain major talent. John Byrne got really irritated at that, and he went over to DC. Some of Jim Shooter's decisions, like insisting on the death of Jean Grey, irritated fans at the time. He also began the idea of the event books with first Contest of Champions and then Secret Wars, which was massive. Some of those events after that could be good, but I think that there were diminishing returns as well. Secret Wars 2, that sucked. It just did. And Shooter would dictate the way these stories should be told, but then he would ignore those rules if he was writing. A lot of writers and artists felt he was being hypocritical there. So that created animosity and tension, and basically it made it very easy for Marvel's executives to let Jim Shooter go when a new company came in and bought them. So who knows how long he would have been able to keep things growing with that attitude, but come on, his era had so many good books. From X-Men to Daredevil to Thor to Spider-Man, I have to give this an S ranking. It's an iconic era. I consider it Marvel's renaissance. Tom DeFalco was next, 1987 to 1994. And I think a lot of folks forget Tom DeFalco's run as editor-in-chief. I think it's just a little under the radar, but it was another successful one. DeFalco got along with talent at Marvel. He continued Marvel's success. He expanded Spider-Man and X-Men, brought it to new heights. He oversaw some of the new fresh talent like Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, and he gave them creative control. There was a new X-Men book and a new Spider-Man book that they got to really have their say in how it went. And there were plenty more besides that. It was a creator-first era. And, while the top artists did leave in 1992 to form Image Comics, Marvel continued to have big success, even without them, on the books like Spider-Man and X-Men, thanks to finding new popular artists to take their place, like Mark Bagley, Joe Madureira. So I'd say the only thing that Tom DeFalco missed was the danger of the speculative bubble that was starting to form as the comic sales continued to grow. But Marvel didn't go bankrupt while DeFalco was in charge. I think this was a very strong time for Marvel, and I will confidently assign an A to Tom, calling him very important to Marvel's history. Now we sort of jump forward a few years, because Marvel did a weird thing for about a year after this by having group editors that each had their domain, like Spider-Man, X-Men, and Avengers, but no editor-in-chief. Kind of weird. But in 1995, Marvel took the X-Men's group editor, Bob Harras, and gave him the editor-in-chief role. So this was a time when Marvel seemed to lose most of their best artists to Image Comics. Not the founders, but like that next generation of talent, and other creator-owned places, Dark Horse was getting some of the best talent, and DC was starting to grow their talent roster again. There was a lot of focus by Bob Harras on the X-Men. That was what he knew best, and that continued to do well, but the rest of the Marvel line kind of fell into disarray. That Spider-Clone saga, it sold okay, but story-wise, it limped along for 2 straight years across 4 or 5 monthly titles. It was way too big and unwieldy, and it ultimately alienated a lot of readers. Also, it ended by bringing back the long-dead villain Green Goblin, which the writers of the Spider-Man books were against. But that was a dictate. There were books with a lot of subpar art, and on titles that should be important to Marvel, like The Avengers. In 1996, Marvel declared bankruptcy. Now, Bob Harras didn't really come up with any new ideas to counter this. In fact, I would argue that his biggest idea was to go back to what had worked for him before. He hired Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld to do Heroes Reborn. Let them take control of Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Avengers, and Captain America. And initially it did so well, but it fizzled out pretty quickly. And Marvel ultimately walked away from it after a 2-year experiment. I will give one creative high in the Bob Harras era to the fact that he then assigned Kurt Busiek and George Perez to work on Avengers. And that was definitely a great run. That was really, really good. But the lows were huge creative stagnation, and the business was so bad that it led to bankruptcy. I am going to put Harras at an F. I don't see how you could not. You know, even if there were good stories, if it goes into bankruptcy, you have to share at least some of that responsibility. It was actually also, just so you know, this was the time where I gave up reading Marvel for a while, which for me is a big deal because I read a lot of comics. Now we get to Joe Quesada. Joe Quesada started working at Marvel in an editorial capacity in 1998. And it was part of an experiment where, again, Bob Harras was giving the editorial control to outside people to control Marvel stuff. This time, though, he let Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti oversee several titles under what they branded Marvel Knights. And that was such a success that it helped pull Marvel out of its bankruptcy. And then Quesada was installed as the new editor-in-chief in 2000. He served a really lengthy run, all the way through 2011. And I'm going to acknowledge right up front that readers, including myself, were justifiably annoyed at Quesada's decision to undo Spider-Man's marriage, and in a very silly supernatural way. But I'll also let you know right now, I'm going to give Joe an A. Let me explain. Under Quesada, Marvel recovered from nearly going out of business to becoming very successful. The Ultimate Universe line was an innovation, and that was tremendously popular. That was a huge addition. Quesada let a lot of creators just go wild, and he hired up-and-coming talent at the time like Brian Michael Bendis, Mark Miller, Ed Brubaker. They came up with a lot of great stories. Quesada restored Marvel's sales and relevance, in my opinion. He pushed both trade paperback collections and he pushed the bookstore market, and that helped bring in new readers. There were probably too many events, but a lot of them did sell very well. Most of them, really. I mean, Civil War, House of M, World War Hulk, those were all big hits. The stories under his leadership introduced the new Guardians of the Galaxy, the Winter Soldier. They provided the blueprint for a lot of the MCU films, and that also launched under Quesada's reign, and he had a lot of direct input in those early movies. So, while the readers don't like all of his editorial mandates, the books sold well, and Marvel grew in a huge way. After Quesada, we get Axel Alonso from 2011 through 2017. Sales-wise, Marvel continued to do pretty well at first, although it would be easy to argue that there was an over-reliance on events and renumbering books. Still, some of those were exceptional. I think Secret Wars, with its 2-year build-up in 2 Avengers titles, that was pretty fantastic. That really was good. Books like Hawkeye by Matt Fraction and David Aja were great. The creation of a new Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, by folks like writer G. Willow Wilson, fantastic. Fantastic. But we have to be honest, and this was an era that began a decline of sales for Marvel. Not huge, but a decline. There were moves to align the comics with the movies that sometimes felt forced. And while I would argue that some of the new takes on characters that had existed for a long time, like Jason Aaron writing Jane Foster as Thor, or Rick Remender introducing Sam Wilson as Captain America. I will argue those were great, but there was a big backlash from a contingent of readers and even retailers. I will also argue back that a lot of those titles used some pretty top-tier talent. You know, Asad Ribic, Russell Dauterman, Stuart Immonen. They definitely had some really great talent at the time. Great artists. But the constant events seemed to burn out readers, and some choices like the retcon that Captain America worked for Hydra, that was very unpopular and took a lot of work to downplay and then undo. If I look at just how healthy Marvel was under Axel, I think it is still fair to give him a B. I may be letting, though, some of my bias show there because I liked Hawkeye, Secret Wars, Ms. Marvel, and Thor throughout that period. There were a lot of good books. And finally, we get to C.B. Cebulski, who has been the editor-in-chief from 2017 until basically just now. But C.B. Cebulski kind of started his run as editor-in-chief under a bit of a cloud. He had previously pretended to be an Asian writer named Akira Yoshida to get freelance writing jobs while serving as a regular editor at Marvel, something that was against the rules. Not great. Initially, he kept the comics pretty stable. Sometimes that was boosted with new number ones, something that I don't think helps the titles long term. I think it never really helps. He did have a global outreach talent policy that led to a few incredible artists. I think Peach Momoko is certainly a prime example of that. You know, she did a lot of great stuff for Marvel and continues to. A lot of artists at Marvel, though, these days seem to have trouble standing out. And Marvel has slowly gotten lapped by DC in the last couple of years, who have come from behind with their new Absolute comics. And they are absolutely eating up Marvel's market share. Marvel seems to have no clear direction anymore. It isn't creator first. It's just event after event with relaunch after relaunch. And sometimes, look, there are good books in there. I'll point out Immortal Hulk, Ryan North's long run on Fantastic Four, but that hasn't completely translated into big sales. Even when the sales are good, you know, the new version of the Ultimate line started strong, only for Marvel to reveal that they were ending it after 2 years, and so people gave up. They weren't invested, and sales sagged. And it kind of petered out with no really interesting ending, in my opinion. Look, every good era has some bad books, and every bad era has had some good books. But I have to admit, Marvel right now seems to be just running on momentum, and I'm giving CB an F. Let me know if you think I got something massively wrong, but I gave this a good amount of thought. And I'll also say that the editor position is a bit thankless in comics. You rarely get credit for the successes, but you always share in the blame for the mistakes, right? It also seems easy sometimes to look at things from the outside and ask, why isn't the editor hiring this top-tier person? Why aren't they following this successful model that manga has given us? And you know, these are all good questions that probably could eventually be solutions. But it's also worth noting that Marvel and DC, while being the biggest comics publishers, are also both a very small piece of much larger companies now. Those companies seem very happy to mostly let the comics do what they want, you know? But they don't support them with marketing dollars or ideas for new distribution methods. They're happy to let things just continue. If I could implement just one thing at Marvel right now, it would be this: an enhanced creator compensation package for creating new characters. Every strong era of Marvel has had their writers and artists give them a bunch of new ideas. And if there was more incentive, the talent wouldn't always keep their best ideas for the creator-owned books. They would give some of them to Marvel. Open up those purse strings a little, Marvel. There is no question in my mind that it would lead to more engaged creators that are also happy to promote their books a lot harder and better comics. Folks, thank you so much for watching. You might be interested in some more videos, so I'll show you some options. And until I see you next time, keep reading comics. When Marvel created... The hell was that?